Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pevav. We're going to get started from the very bottom of Pei Hayamad Bet. We were in the middle of dealing with the Mishnah about where you can bring oil from and where you can't, where's the best place to get oil. We had some stories about that. Now we're moving on to the end part of the Mishnah, which brings a bunch of different kind of oils that you can't bring from. Okay, now from this Ampaktan, which we're going to see later as Ampakinan, or I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce, we'll get there when we get there. And we said imevi kasher, but most of the Gersaot actually said if you bring from there, it's actually disqualified. And then you can't bring from ones that are soaked in water, ones that are pickled, right? Or ones that are, right, the oil comes from olives that were cooked because they were obviously inferior quality, and therefore you can't use that for the libations on the altar. So now the Gemara is going to say, Emevi'in lo mivetas valim, that's just a quote, and really they want to quote the end of the Mishnah. V'hatanya emevi'in ampaktan v'emevi pasul, okay, which sounds like our Mishnah again if you go by the version that if you bring it's disqualified, but now it finishes mipnei shu schaf, because it's really just like the liquid that comes out of it. It's not actually olive oil. It's not oil at all. It's just like if you the ampakinon, which we're going to see what it is. It's basically taking unripe olives and basically trying to get the liquid out. That's just like a juice. That's not oil. So now why is this a problem? Well, the Mishnah listed it among oils that are disqualified. It didn't put in a different category like this isn't even oil, but this Braita makes it clear that it's not really oil. So Amar of Yosef lo kasha harabi chia harabi Shimon bar Rabbi. Now we're going to see that there's a bit of subjectivity in this area. Do we view this as oil? Do we view it as juice? Okay, so they say there's Rabbi Chia and there's Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi. To Rabbi Chia zarikli, he would throw it out. He said, this is gross. Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi metabel be. He would actually dip his food in it. He viewed it as olive oil. V'simanech, and how do you remember this? This is actually kind of ironic. Ashirim mekamtzin. Okay, the wealthy are the ones who are much more stingy about things, and in a way, basically in a positive way, I think they're saying that Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi, remember Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was wealthy. He was a Nasi. So they were wealthy. Rabbi Shimon is his son, and yet he would still dip in there. Okay, he would save. Okay, he wouldn't say, "Ooh, this is not really the good stuff." He would even eat that stuff, and that's how you remember that he was the one who saved and used it. Shisha chodashim b'shemen hamor. Okay, now we get to a pasuk from Megillat Esther. There were 6 months. If you remember, they would use the shemen hamor on the women when they were going for the contest who was going to be Achashverosh's bride. My shemen hamor. What is shemen hamor? Rav Huna bar Chia Amar Sitachata, which is known to be balsam oil. That's like the best of the best. Rabbi Yirmiyah, now we're going to see what's the connection. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amal shemen zayit shelo hevi shlish. And we're going to see that that's shemen zayit that was made from olives that didn't yet get to a third of their ripening yet. They haven't, right? They're only a third ripened. And that's exactly what we're going to see is what we've been discussing. This ampaktinon or ampakinon, which we're going to see in a minute. Tanya, and there's another bright that says Rabbi Yehuda Omiel, that the shemen hamor, we're missing those words, but the shemen hamor is ampiknon, which is the same as ampikton. Okay, apparently there's, again, a bit of a issue about what exactly it was called. Shemen zayit shelo hevi shlish. Okay, the shemen hamor, this goes with Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba's approach that the shemen hamor wasn't balsam oil. It was this olive oil that was made from, it was this oil that was made from olives that hadn't reached a third of their development yet. Lama sachino, to what would they use this for? Now we're going to learn what it was used for. Shemashir taseal ma'adena tabasal. It's a hair removal, depilatory cream or depilatory oil that would then also remove the hair and soften the skin. Okay, now we're going to the next part of the Mishnah. That was all to understand what this ampiktan is or ampikanon. So you can't take it from the olives that were soaked in water. Tano Rabbanan. And we had cooked and pickled. Shemen zayit, kavush, shaluk, sharoi. Those are the same three. So oil that was made from pickled, boiled, and soaked. Vishal shmarim, and that was made from using the dregs. Vishal reach, also those that have a bad smell. Lo yavi, don't bring these to the temple for your libations. They may be pasul, and if you bring, it's disqualified. By Rabbah. Now Rabbah is going to ask the same questions that were in the name of Rabbah on the previous page. I wonder if sometimes Rabbah and Rabbah get mixed up, and maybe all these questions were either asked by Rabbah or asked by Rabbah. Hikdisho maushil kala mishum b'hamum. If you sanctify them anyway, are you going to get lashes like you do for bringing a balmum for the altar? Kevan shepasul kebalmum dami, since it's disqualified to view it like a blemished item. Dilma aim balmum ela b'beima, or maybe balmum is only by animals. And again, just like all those questions in yesterday's daf, we end with teku. We don't have an answer. Okay, new Mishnah. Shlosha zitim hem. We're now going to learn there's actually three. We're going to talk about 3 stages of picking the fruits off the tree. Okay, there's the ones that are at the top that are the most ripe. They're ripen the quickest because they get the most sunlight. There's the ones at the secondary level, and then there's the ones below that never really fully ripen, or they're not as good. And then we're going to see that there are 3 processes in the preparation of making olive oil that are going to be that we're going to go through in each of the 3 stages. You're going to see that the process is pretty identical between the stages with minor differences. And we're going to see there's a bit of a debate on 2 issues between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. Shlosha zeitim hem. So there's 3 processes, and there's actually 3, right? There's 2 threes. There's 3 processes they go through, but really what they're talking about right now is the 3 stages. So the first stage, okay? Right, and they each make 3 types of oils. Okay, really in the end, it's going to be like 9 types of oils, you'll see. Hazayit harishon, so the first ones, migargero berosh hazayit. You're going to collect the olives from the very top of the tree. Like we said, it gets the most sunlight, they're going to ripen quickest. Also, by the way, we mean 3 times, right? The first stage, the ones at the top are ripe. The second stage, the ones lower down get ripe. And the third stage, the ones even below. Then what do you do with the olives when you have them? So you collect them. Now, you crush them in what's called a miducha, a mortar. Crush them. Noten, and that's to start getting to soften them, okay? And crack them a little so that the juices start flowing. Then you put them in a basket, and then you let the oil drip out. Rabbi Yehuda omil, svivot hasal. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda says we actually do it on the sides of the basket because he doesn't want the olives sitting in the oil that's coming out of it, because that's just going to make the olives dirtier. They're going to end up with, right, it's not going to be as clear. They're going to end up with some of the dregs and things. So he puts it on the sides, and then the oil, what most of the commentators explain was that there were cone-shaped bowls or baskets, and the oil would then drip down, and because the oil would start coming out, the dregs would stick to the sides. Since you put the olives on the sides, it wouldn't actually get to where the oil is dripping down, and it would go out more clear. So we have this first debate about whether you put them in the basket and let the oil drip, or whether you put them on the sides of the basket, according to Rabbi Yehuda, so only, right, you don't end up with the dregs in your oil. Zerishon. That's the first part of the process. And we're going to learn that the first part of the process is the best. Okay, it's the ideal way of doing it. You're going to get the best olive oil from there. Chozer v'to'em b'koreh. Then you're going to put a beam on it. That was what they used in the olive press. There was a beam that you would put a heavy beam on top of the olives, and that would get out more olive oil. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ba'avanim. He said if you put a beam, it's going to crush them too much, and then pieces are going to come out. It's not going to be as clear. So he said you use stones and not a beam. Zesheni, that's the second stage of, again, we're in the first though. The first category of olives, the second stage. Chazar v'tachan v'ta'an. Then you're going to do it again. You're going to do one more thing though. You're going to grind them. After you grind them, you're going to put the beam back on them. So you're now going to put them in a millstone where you grind them up. Okay, that's usually there's 2 stones, one on top of the other, and you turn the top one, and then everything gets crushed. Then, right, that's different from a mortar, where you just kind of crush them with a pestle. Then vita'an, and then you put a beam on another time. So stage 3 has both grinding them and then putting the beam on. Zesh shlishi, that's stage 3. Harishon the menorah. Now, why does it matter what stage? Well, the first stage is used for the menorah. That was what we call shemen zayit zach katit. Okay, we're going to talk about that soon. That's for the menorah. Hashar the menachot, the other stages could be used for the mincha, but you can't use it for the menorah anymore because it's not as clear. You've already started putting the beam on or the stones. It's going to end up with some dregs, not for lighting. Hashini, stage 2. Now you're going to have the second set of harvesting the olives. Megarguro b'rosh hagag. right now, this word is megargaro. We're going to have a debate in the Gemara whether it's megargaro or megalgalo, but megargaro means you collect it like we saw before, berosh hagag. But this time, different interpretations. It could be you're standing on the roof because it's about the height of the roof, okay, which is lower down than the upper part. Could mean some other things, but we'll stick with that. Kotesh v'noten l'toch hasal. Again, now, here the process is going to be the same. After you gather them, you're going to then put them in a basket with you're going to use in a mortar and crush them. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Svivot Hasal, he says only on the sides of the basket, not in the basket. Zerishon, that's stage 1 of stage 2, right, of part 2, the second harvest. To'em b'koreh, then you put the korah, then you put the beam on. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bavanim, Rabbi Yehuda again says stones. Zeh sheni, that's stage 2. Chazar v'tacham v'ta'an, zeh shlishi. Okay, same 3 stages, then you're going to again grind it and then put the beam on again. Harishon l'menorah, sha'ar l'menachot. And same thing, even though these olives are not the best as they were, the top ones were, but you can still use the first stage of this. If you do just the first stage, you can use them for the menorah, for lighting the candles, and the other ones could be used for the mincha. Shlishi. Otno bebeit habad ad shilkeh. This one these are not as ripe. So when you take the third, which is the last harvest, you're going to have to put these in a basket in the Beit Habad, which is where they would crush them, but you wouldn't crush them yet. You would leave them to sit there until they would soften. And then you're going to be able to get out the stuff. But before you start getting out the oil, the problem is when you leave them to sit, they get this liquid on them, which we don't really want. So ma'aleo minagvo b'rosh hagag. So you bring it up to your roof. That was the best place. That's where they always dried things out. Kotesh v'noten l'toch hasal, and again, now you do your stage 1 started a little differently, but now you're going to actually do the same thing, which is crush them in the mortar. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Svivot Hasal, and again, Rabbi Yehuda says, don't put them in the mortar, right? Don't use the mortar in the bottom of the basket, right? Don't put them all in the basket itself. Put them on the sides of the basket. Zerishon, that's stage 1 of again, the third harvest. To'em b'korah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bavanim, again, put the beam on, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, put stones on. Zeh sheni, chazar v'tacham v'ta'an, same thing, stage 3, grind them, and then put the beam on. Harishon l'menorah, sha'ar l'menachot, and same thing, stage 1, third harvest, you could use for the menorah, stage 2 and 3, you could use for menachot. Okay, that's our Mishnah. Now we're going to have a question. Ibayilhu, migargarotzanan or migalgalotzanan? Okay, do we mean migargaro, collect them? Or do we mean migalgalo, which is leave them a little bit more to ripen? Okay, which could mean leave them on the tree until they ripen. Okay, it's not 100% clear. Tashma, they said, let's learn from here. Shemen zayit mizeto. Okay, they darshan here. The pasuk is shemen zayit. This is from Parshat Atat Tzaveh B'nai Israel. V'yikolecha shemen zayit zach katit lamaor. So they're going to bring shemen zayit. What did they learn about the shemen zayit? Mizeto. It's shemen that comes straight out of the zayit. What does that mean? What they mean is you have to ripen it so much that the shemen zayit, the oil is dripping out of the olive already from the beginning. Mikanamru, from here they learned, zayit rishon megalgalo b'rosh hazayit v'konsol lebeit haba v'tochno b'rechaim v'notno b'salim. So from here they learned the first harvest, you leave it on the tree until it's so ripe that the oil is coming out of it, and then you put it in the Beit Habad, and then you grind it in the millstone, then you put it in the baskets. Shemen hayotze mimenu zeh haya rishon. That is the ideal. Okay, you can already see there's a problem if you were paying close attention, which is according to this source. So first of all, they say it's megalgalo, not megargaro. It doesn't mean you collect it. It means you leave it on the tree until there's so much oil that it's kind of dripping out when you take it off the tree. But then it says stage 1 for this is actually grinding it. Now, we learned before you don't grind it right away, right? Grinding it right away would already get you dregs in the oil. We want the finest oil. Doesn't have the cleanest oil, right? That doesn't have, or clearest, doesn't have any dregs in it. So there's going to be a bit of a question. But then it continues, and the rest of it is going to be very similar. Ta'am b'korah. Then you put a beam on. Shemen hayotze mimenu haya sheni. Okay, by the way, they already brought this for the purpose that we wanted, which is megalgalo and not megargaro. But they're continuing anyway. So then you put the beam on. Shemen hayotze mimenu zeh haya sheni. Okay, this is really going to be repetitive. You put the beam on, and that's the second stage. V'chazar v'parak tacham v'ta'an. And then again, you're going to grind it the second time. Okay, again, what the difference was, in the beginning we saw it, you grind it with a mortar in the Mishnah. This says you grind it with the millstone from the beginning in stage 1, but obviously stage 3 is the same. Zeh haya shlishi. Havishon l'menorah, sha'ar l'menachot. Again, first stage goes for the menorah. Second 2 are for menachot. V'chein zayit sheni. Okay, same thing with zayit sheni. They don't even bother to repeat the whole thing because wonder why the Mishnah didn't say the same thing either. It just should have said, and yes, same thing by the Sheni, because it really was the same. And Zayit Shlishi, a little bit different. Otno bebeit haparad shilkeh. Again, you have to soften it first. Umaleh lerosh hagag v'oseh oto kimin tmacha ad sheyazuvu meimap. Here they add a little bit more, which is when they would put it on the roof, they would put it in a basket that was wider at the bottom, narrower at the top. It would collect there, and then it would dry out in that way. Like it would actually allow for the liquid to come out of it. Then you bring it to the Beit Habad, where the olive press, and they would grind it. They would put it in the basket. That was stage one. Now you know the rest. Put the beam on. That oil would be the second. Right? So again, take it out of there, then go again and put it in the millstone and grind it. Harishon lemenorah, v'ashar lemenachot. Okay, again, stage one would be able to be used for the menorah, the other for the menachot. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo haya tochno b'rechaim ela kotsho b'machteshet. Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, you don't use the rechaim in stage one, the millstone, you use the machteshet. Okay, now we see that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with someone about this issue. So what appeared in our Mishnah is Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda did disagree, seems to be actually Rabbi Yehuda, right? But it seems a little strange because our Mishnah said there were all these machlokot between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, and it was about stone, right? Number one, was it on the side of the basket or inside the basket? Number two, was it stones or a beam, right? Rabbi Yehuda was stones and side of the basket. But he didn't really argue about the lichtosh, and if he did, it should have said it in his name. So the Gemara is going to say, we'll get to that in a minute. But now they're just going to quote the three things Rabbi Yehuda said, which again, when we looked at our Mishnah, was only two. V'lo haya to'em b'korah el b'avanim, v'lo haya notno b'salin el litoch svivot hakli. So those are the three things, that unique opinions of Rabbi Yehuda. You don't start stage one with the millstone, right? You can see that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is all this issue if we don't want to get any dregs in there. So don't use the millstone because it'll be small pieces and they'll fall through maybe. And don't use the beam because that's too strong. Use stones. And don't put it right in the basket, but put it on the sides because that will allow for less dregs to fall in. So now they say Hagufa Kashya. So based on that point, okay, this was all, again, we brought this for the Megalgalo, but once we see the end of this Braita with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion and the three things he disagrees about, our Mishnah now makes no sense. Because our Mishnah says, Kotesh Mane Rabbi Yehuda, right, where it talks about the Kitosh, the mortar is specifically Rabbi Yehuda. Toch Hasal Atan the Rabbanan. But that line basically combines Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, because that line says, I'm going back to the Mishnah, Kotesh v'noten l'toch hasal. You use the mortar and then you put it in the basket. Well, that doesn't work. The beginning is Rabbi Yehuda, the next part is the rabbis. So how do you explain it? We're going to basically say the Tana of the Mishnah held like Rabbi Yehuda when it came to the Ketisha and not the Tchina, right? The crushing and not the grinding, but held like the rabbis on the issue of putting it inside and not necessarily needing to put it on the sides of the basket. Okay, and that's how we explain our Mishnah. Now we're moving on to the next Mishnah. Harishon Shabrishon. By the way, I said the next Mishnah is going to talk about the grapes, but I meant like the next section of Mishnah. Okay, we're still in the olives. Harishon Shabrishon ein lamala himenu, hasheni shabarishon v'harishon shabasheni shavim. Okay, we're now going to put these in order. We're going to grade them. We're going to say the first of the first is the best. Okay, remember we have 9 cases now. So the first of the first is the best. There's nothing higher than that. And now everything's going to match up to the one in the next stage, one below, one above. So hasheni shabarishon. So stage 2 of the first harvest is equal to harishon shabasheni. Okay, equal to the first stage and the second. We're just going to go down every time one level. Shlishi shabarishon. Okay, now we're going to have the third in the first harvest is going to be equal to sheni shabarishon vasheni shabasheni is like the second stage in the second harvest, and like harishon shabashlishi, and like the first stage of the third harvest. So we have level 1 is 1 of 1, right? Level 2 is going down 1 in the first harvest, the top level in the second harvest. Level 3 is, right, third in gradation is the third of the first harvest equal to the second in the second harvest and the first in the third harvest. And then we have one more where we're going to overlap. Hashlishi shabasheni vasheni shabashlishi, right? The third and the second, which no longer has a parallel in the first because we're done with the 3 in the first, and the second and the third, hasheni shabashlishi, shavim, they're equal, and hashlishi shabashlishi and lamate menu, the worst of the worst is the third of the third. Av kol menachot hayu bedin sheyitanu shemen zayitzach. Now, really, theoretically, all the Menachot should have needed that high level, right? The one we talked about in the Mishnah that only the menorah gets, but right, the menorah gets only that stage. You would have thought, or it should have had the Menachot also, but because why? Well, you would have said the following kavachomer. Look, the menorah is not for eating, and yet it needs this high level. So menachot shem la'achila eno din shitanu shemen zayitzach, right? Menachot that are supposed to be eaten, all the more so we should use better oil. Talmud lomar, what you would think that what's for eating is better, needs the better. No, Talmud lomar zach katit lemaor ve'ein zach katit lemenachot, because it specifically says in the pasuk I quoted before, shemen zayitzach katit lemaor. Katit, by the way, means crushed. Crushed for the lighting. Okay, that's where we learn that it's specifically for lighting, not for menachot. Okay, moving now to Amud Bet. Gemara starts like this. Shavin, wait a minute. Something in the Mishnah really made no sense because it said stage 1 of 1 is top level. Then you have stage 2 of 1 is equal to stage 1 of 2. That makes of the second harvest. That makes no sense. Because Ha'amar, Rishon le'menorah, v'ashar le'menachot. Didn't you say the first level of 1, the first level of the second harvest, and the first level of the third harvest, all is good for the menorah? That means 1, 1, 1, right? That's high level, but level 2 of 1 is actually worse than level 1 of 2, because 1 of 2 could be used for the menorah, and 2 of 1, right? Stage 2 of level 1, harvest 1, can't be used for the menorah. So that didn't really make sense. So I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, my shavin lemenachot. This whole Mishnah is talking about when it comes to minchas, which I guess makes sense because we're in Masechet Menachot. When it comes to minchas, we rate them differently. Okay, when it comes, and you can distinguish, because oil for lighting needs to be this very clear oil, but oil for eating has different standards, and therefore the standards are going to be that second level of 1 is going to be equal to first level of 2. Okay, but not in terms of how clear it is. Clear is one thing, but better for eating is going to be a different standard. So now we're going to have a bright about this whole thing, about you need zach does need to be this as clear as possible for the menachot. Tanu Rabbanan, zach, ein zach ela naki. Okay, zach means clean, right? Not having anything else in it. Rabbi Yehuda omer katit, ein katit ela katush. Okay, he doesn't disagree, it's just defining a different word. Katit means katush, like we said, crushed. Now, you might have thought that maybe crushing it is actually worse for the menachot. Maybe you can't use that for the menachot. Maybe it's only for the candles you can use crushed, but maybe crushed is actually a problem by the mincha. Talmud lomar v'saron solet balul b'shemen katit. But it says by the mincha, you need nisaron of solet, balul mixed with shemen katit. That means crushed, right? Oil that came from crushing the olives. So you see the crush can be used. So why does it say specifically katit lama'ol? Why does that go together as if katit is only for lighting? What they wanted to tell you is you could crush it. It's not saying you crush it only for lighting. You also crush it for menachot. But you could crush it for lighting, and we don't make you have the most pure that wouldn't have any crushing at all. Because remember, the more you crush something, right, which we talked about grinding all the more so, but you're going to end up with dregs. So you might think maybe you can't crush it at all. But because to save people money, because if you go with the high level, it's going to, and you won't even, right, it's going to take forever to get that oil out of those, and it's going to cost a lot more money then. So my chisachon, what's this idea of chisachon? Amar Rabbi Elazar, and we've seen this a whole bunch of times in Shas, HaTorah chasa al mamonan shel Yisrael, right? That the Torah is worried about the money. They don't want to make everything so expensive, so they allowed crushed olives. But of course, you can also use them for the mincha, and that we see from the pasuk about the mincha. Tzav b'nei Yisrael v'yikol lecha shemen zayit zach. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, elecha v'lo li. Look what it says, v'yikol elecha. Elecha means for the Jewish people, not for God. Now, they want to say it like this, Lola ora ani tzarich. In other words, don't think that the menorah is for light for God, that God needs light. God doesn't need our light, okay? And not only that, but the specific placement of the menorah and the shulchan in the heichal supports this idea. Shulchan b'tzafon u'menorah b'daron. They're on opposite sides of the room, north and south of the heichal. Rabbi Zreika, Rabbi Elazar, lo la'achila ani tzarich v'lo la'ora ani tzarich. This is an indicator that God doesn't need it for eating, right? The bread for eating, and he doesn't need the menorah for lighting. Because if he did, where do you usually put your light? Where your table is, so you can see what you're eating. God doesn't need the light for the table and the table for the, right? Those two things are far apart from each other, showing this idea. Vayas labayit chalonei shkufim atumim. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, this is Shlomo HaMelech, okay, in Sefer Melachim. Tana shkufim mibifnim va'atumim mibachutz. Okay, there's a lot of problems with the girsa and what each word means. Okay, but basically we're going to say shakuf means transparent and atum means opaque. But what they really mean is like this. Lo la'ora nitzarich. In other words, God doesn't need it, and that's why the windows there were made wide. Okay, normally, how would you do a window? If you had a thick wall, and instead of your wall, normally our windows fit into, like a square frame. But let's say you wanted a lot of light to come in, you would have it narrow on the outside and it would widen the wall, like the opening in the wall where your window would be, would widen as it goes inside to allow more light to be spread. But in the Heichal, it was the opposite. Okay, so the windows would be going wide on the outside, narrow on the inside to let less light in to show that God doesn't need our lights. Okay, that's how Shlomo built the temple. Michutz laparochet ha'edut ba'ol moed. Okay, now the menorah stands, okay, outside the parochet ba'ol moed, yarochoto aron mi'erev haboker, that's where the menorah is. Why does it say michutz laparochet ha'edut? It should have just been outside the parochet. Edut hu l'chol ba'ei ha'olam, b'chol ba'ei ha'olam shashchina shora b'Yisrael. This is an edut that Shechina is there. Ve'im tomar le'ora nitzarich, and if you say it's for the light, God needs the light. The Jews went in the desert 40 years. What provided them light? The Amud Eish of God, right? The fire, pillar of fire that God was. So this is an edut that the Shekhinah is there because it's a sign that God doesn't need our light. And therefore, it's a sign that God is our light and the Shekhinah is there and therefore there's no need for light at all. My eduta. Now, what provides this testimony? Amarava zer ner ma'aravi shenotim b'shemen keneged chavroteha umimena haya madlik uba haya masayim. Okay, they would use this ner ma'aravi, the most western light. Okay, there's actually a big debate what exactly the most western light is. Some people say, now, it really depends. Okay, what they're going to say is that was kind of the symbol of the presence of God in the sanctuary. That it had, right, they would put the same amount that they would put in all the other candles, and then that would yet light, that would stay lit as long as all the others. And that was kind of this miracle that would show the presence of God in the temple. Now, which is the Ner Maravi? Big debate. So it depends how the menorah was situated in the room. Okay, so we learned before that the shulchan is in the north and the menorah is in the south. The question is, did it face north-south? Or did it face east-west? Now, if it faced east-west, then it's very easy to say the Ner Maravi is the western one. Even that, there's a debate. Okay, it's the one that's closest to the Kodesh Kodeshim, which would make sense, actually. Some people say west means relatively, meaning it's the second one from the east. It's just more western than the eastern, than the one on the east. Okay, and it's actually number 2 rather than number 7, the last one. Some people say that the menorah went north-south, and then there is no western one because they're north-south. There's one more north, there's one more south, but there's none more west. And then they say that the middle one actually leaned over toward the west, toward the Kodesh Kodeshim, and that was the one. Okay, so there's a big debate about what this western one is. Okay, we're going to start now with the next Mishnah. We won't even finish it today, but we'll get started. From where would they bring wine? Okay, this is going to be parallel to the other Mishnayot. Kaduchayin va'atulayin. Okay, these were 2 places. Alpha liyayin, they had the best grapes for wine. Shniya lehem beit rima ubeit lavan bahal. Ukfar signa babik'ah. Okay, these are somewhere around where Modi'in is nowadays, not far from Lod. Beit rima beit lavan in the mountains, and Kfar signa in the Bik'ah, in the valley. Okay, really you could bring from anywhere, but this is where they would bring from generally. Okay, you wouldn't bring from a fertilized, again, not a fertilized vineyard, not one that needs irrigating, and not from one that you planted other crops around, because it would soak up the nutrients. But if you did anyway, it's fine. Okay, again, we're talking about the wine libation, just like before we're talking about the oil. Okay, helios is sun in Greek. Don't bring from the sun-dried grapes. Okay, they're sweeter and they're not as good. Right, because they're sweetened by the sun. But if you bring, it's okay. Ein mevi'im yashan, you don't bring old wine. Divrei Rebbe, v'chachamim makshirim. We'll debate whether you can bring this. Ein mevi'im, by the way, part of what's interesting about this is there's a whole issue about whether Kiddush, you can use wine for Kiddush only if it could be used as libations. Okay, there's an opinion about that, and therefore there's this discussion as relevance for, can you bring wine, can you use wine that was made from raisins? Okay, things like that. These questions come up in more modern times. There's actually practical ramifications for this. Okay, not wine that you sweetened or that you smoked or cooked in order to make it sweeter. This, by the way, is yain mevushal, right? That we there's no yain nesach for it because again we didn't put it on our altars, so they didn't either, or we don't have to worry about it. We had that all in avodah zarah. Ve'im evi pasul. Okay, if they did bring it, then it's disqualified. Ve'im evi min hadiliyot, not from grapes that were draped over the vines that were draped on sticks or poles that were high up off the ground. Element of ragliyot, the ones that were a foot level, not a foot off the ground, but at where people's feet are. Umina kramim ha'avudim, and it had to be a cultivated vineyard. Velo konsimoto b'chatzavim g'dolim ela b'chaviyot k'tanot. They wouldn't gather it in big barrels, but in smaller ones. Ve'eino memalei ha'chafit ad pia, and they wouldn't fill it up all the way. Last line for today, kadesh rechono def. Okay, so we wanted the if you have it completely full, there's nowhere for the aroma to go. If you have some airspace at the top, then the aroma will waft up to there. And when you open it, the aroma will come out, which is, I think we want to get rid of the smell. It's not like a smell that you want there, and that's better for the wine. Okay, so again, all these ways of saying we want the best of the best. Okay, so we started with talking about this wine, this ampikton, which we said ampikanon, which was wine, oil that was made from olives that were only a third ripened. From there, we moved to the stages of harvesting. We had 3 times 3, basically. We talked about the different stages, and only the first stage of each one could be used for the menorah. The other ones could be used for the menachot. We had a little bit of an issue with the Mishnah. It seemed to go against Rabbi Yehuda and with Rabbi Yehuda all at the same time. So we said our Tana must have like a unique position, held like the rabbis and like Rabbi Yehuda, each on a different issue. From there, we got, and also we said it's not megargaro, it's megalgalo. You leave them on the tree until they're so ripe, those first ones, so that the olive oil is already dripping out of them. Then we talked about the next Mishnah about comparing all the levels, which then seemed to be weird, but then we said, oh no, that works with the Menachot. It doesn't work for the menorah, but for the world of Menachot, there are gradations like that. And we had this whole thing about you might have thought you need that high level for the Menachot, and we had drashot where we basically explained that you don't. You just need it for the candles. And from there we moved, had a little more other things going on there, and where the shulchan is, where the menorah is, and this whole idea about how God doesn't need our light, God doesn't need our food, it's really for us. That was a drasha. We got there because we were in drashot of the pasuk v'yikhu elech Hashem and zayitzach. First we started with the zayitzach and the katit, then we moved on to the elecha, for us, not for God. And then we finished up with the wine, where they would bring the wine from, and all the rules about where you could bring wine from, what kind of grapes. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day. And Moadim l'simcha.